Vivekananda Suraye Satchit Sukha Swarupaya Swami Tapaharini. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our ongoing class on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. A heads up on the next two classes. We have two more classes in September. So the next class is next Thursday, September 11th at 7:30 p.m. And one toward the end of the month, Thursday, September 25th at 7:30 p.m. And today we're going to be discussing, hopefully, Sutras 2.21 to 23. So we're going to try to tackle three sutras today. Pages 225 to 232 of Edwin Bryant's The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which is one of our main textbooks. And the assignment for our next class, assuming we get up to 2.23, which is a bold assumption, but it would be for next Thursday's class 2.24 to 27, pages 232 to 239 of Bryant. I have a feeling we're not going to make it through to the end of 2.23, the commentary, and so we're going to pick up from 23 and go up to 26 or 27. Okay, so now, last time, if you recall, anyone who's following the class, you remember that I opened this wonderful can of worms, my favorite can of worms, in the context of Samkhya and Yoga, which is who exactly is bound and who exactly seeks liberation, according to Samkhya and Yoga philosophy. And I've been arguing that they don't really have a coherent and clear answer to that question. But the answer that many of the traditional commentators tend to give, at least typically, is the buddhi, the intellect, okay, the mind. But they don't seem to be consistent. We're going to find that when we start looking at Sutra 21, for instance, we're going to see that. Sometimes they shift to say the purusha, right? Okay, but I think in both cases, either candidate doesn't work, because purusha is insentient, so it can't be bound or liberated, and purusha is ever free, nitya mukta, also can't be bound, and doesn't need liberation because it's ever liberated. So there's been this ongoing kind of question that I've been raising throughout the class. Now, I encourage you guys to argue with me. I'm a philosopher and I like debate, and I encourage you to add a comment in the YouTube under the YouTube video, which one person did, one brave soul. His name is Lakshman Win, and I'm grateful because it's a very thoughtful comment. I read it very carefully, and I wanted to address it first, Lakshman's comment, and I'm going to respond to Lakshman's comments, and I think actually his comments are helping me to, I think they'll help us to advance the discussion, move like a couple of steps further in this discussion, gain some clarity about exactly what I'm arguing, what I see as a problem, and so on. And then you can, Lakshman and others, you can try to still, so he's trying to defend the Samkhya Yoga position, basically saying that, no, there's no real problem. There's a clear answer to the question of who is bound and who seeks liberation. So let me read you his comment. He says, Pranams, from your book, and he gives a direct quotation. I like him already. Okay. If beliefs and feelings are plausibly taken to be first personal conscious states, then even believing or feeling that one is conscious requires consciousness. That's a direct quotation from my book. The book is Karma and Rebirth in Hinduism, which I'd quoted last time. Now, what he says is, it seems to me that your definition of consciousness is not the same as the traditional yoga definition. The idea that consciousness is a first personal state already implicitly includes asmita. We've talked about asmita in previous classes. He defines it. Asmita, the feeling of being an individual, and the feeling, quote, I am the one who has consciousness. My understanding, meaning Lakshman's, my understanding is that this would be considered reflected consciousness by the commentators. Note the term, reflected consciousness. This is going to be a key point of discussion. So he takes this asmita, which is part of the mind, the insentient mind, to be reflected consciousness. This is what he takes to be bound, and this is what he takes to be the entity that seeks liberation. He says, Lakshman says, Purusha simply shines. It does nothing else. It is, and shines he puts in quotes. It is not dependent on any qualia, thought, or experience. It doesn't need self-reflection, which seems to be how modern philosophers and scientists think of and define consciousness. The chitta, the mind which is made up of asmita, manas, and buddhi, is simply reflecting the pure light of the purusha in different ways. So I think Lakshman is clearly taking the chitta, the insentient mind, to be the reflecting consciousness. Reflected consciousness. Okay. Now, then he refers to some of my comments based on timestamps. So he says 5710. Here it's saying the mind, what I'm saying is, here it's saying the mind mistakes this reflection in the mirror. Is the mind the buddhi? And he gives the answer, part of the mind, chitta, is the asmita or the ego. And he mentions Yoga Sutra 2.6. Ego is to consider the nature of the seer and the nature of the instrumental power of seeing to be the same thing. Okay, so there's a little bit more to it, but let me first begin to respond. Okay, so I think Lakshman is right that the definition of consciousness I give is not the same as the traditional yoga definition. That's true. But even yoga philosophy has to account for first-person experience, first-person conscious awareness. They don't deny that we have first-person experiences, right? If somebody hits me on the arm, I feel pain. That's a first-person experience, right? So now, what he's saying, so let me keep reading his response, then we can get a little bit more detail. So then he says, at 5720, I make this comment, but then again, you get the same problem. It's on the side of insentient nature again. What exactly is this mind? So again and again, I see this vacillation in the Samkhya Yoga response to the question of who is bound and liberated. Either they say it's buddhi, and then I say the problem is that's insentient, can't be bound or liberated. A stone doesn't seek liberation. Sometimes they say, no, it's purusha. But purusha is ever free, so how can that be, right? And so back and forth. So this is the mind side of the dialectic, where I'm saying that can't be the right candidate. And then Lakshman says, answer, correct. The chitta does not have consciousness of its own. It only reflects the consciousness of the purusha. So he clearly takes the chitta, the insentient mind, to be reflected consciousness, okay? And then he says, like a lake reflecting the moon's light. When there are ripples, vrittis, on the lake, chitta, it looks like the moon, the purusha, is affected, but it is not. Some of these vrittis come from the manas. These include emotions. So all suffering and exuberance takes place ultimately in the chitta. Then he says, when we are ignorant, klesha avidya, of our ever-content and eternal nature, we have the mistaken belief that we are the chitta/body instead of the purusha. Klesha asmita. Because of this, the attachments and aversions, the kleshas raga and dvesha, come up to try to find contentment, and the fear of death, klesha abhinivesha, comes up. All these kleshas are in the chitta. So then he asks, this is his summing up, who or what is realized or freed? The purusha doesn't do anything. It is never bound. It is never freed. It never suffers. Therefore, it seems clear to me that the mind, the chitta, becomes free when the kleshas are made inert through kriya yoga and samadhi and then dissolved back into its original matrix. YS 2.10. This is my understanding. Thanks for these classes. They're a great source of joy. So thank you, Lakshman, because that was a very, as I said, very thoughtful and evidence-based response to my challenge. And so here is my response in turn. Okay, so here's the main thing. You want to claim that it is the insentient mind or some part of the insentient mind which makes the mistake of identifying purusha with prakriti, mistakenly identifies with the body-mind complex, right? Now, here's the question, Lakshman and others. See, or let me put it this way. ChatGPT, it's on everybody's tongues these days, right? We all use it, most of us. Okay, doesn't ChatGPT make mistakes? Obviously, we all know that. It's called hallucination. It just says things that are, very confidently, it'll say things wrong. Although it's happening with less frequency now, it seems like. Okay, but still, it'll make mistakes. But does ChatGPT have first-person awareness of making a mistake? No, it has no first-person awareness of anything. It lacks first-person awareness. It lacks first-person consciousness, right? So now, Lakshman, when you're saying it's asmita, this sense of I-ness, that makes the mistake of identifying the conscious self with the body-mind complex. It seems like we can only understand that in terms of like a ChatGPT kind of mistake, an AI mistake. It'll make a mistake. Computers make mistakes, right? Sometimes. But they don't have first-person awareness. They don't feel first-person pleasure. They don't have any first-person experiences, right? But why are you here now? Because you're spiritual aspirants. And because you're not happy. You're not satisfied with what life so far has given you. And you want liberation, you want God realization, you want self-realization, right? And usually many of us enter spiritual life through suffering. All of those are first-person experiences, which asmita can't have. Asmita cannot have it. Why? Because it's not even sentient. It's not capable of first-person experiences. Okay. So the real question is, so that entity which is bound and which seeks liberation has to have first-person consciousness. And Lakshman, you're suggesting asmita. Maybe this is the next iteration in the debate. Try to explain how asmita has first-person consciousness. Okay. Now, you might say, as you do in your lengthy response, that, well, yeah, the thing is that chitta in Samkhya Yoga philosophy is reflected consciousness. And so it borrows the consciousness, first-person consciousness, from the purusha, right? That seems to be, I think that's the gist of your response. Now, here's the problem. So now I'm going to introduce an alternative philosophical paradigm. Okay. I've been saying all along that Samkhya and Yoga philosophy, they are unable to provide a coherent answer to the question of who is bound and who seeks liberation, because they don't have their metaphysical system, which is basically a duality between Purusha and Prakriti, doesn't make room for a jiva, the concept of a jivatma, an individual conscious soul, an eternal individual conscious soul. Okay, let me try to flesh that out today. And I think Lakshman's response is helping me to kind of pressing me to clarify exactly what I mean by that. So now, among all the different traditions of Vedanta, the Vedantic school that comes closest to Samkhya Yoga is, very obviously, classical Advaita Vedanta. Okay? And in fact, not a coincidence, because classical Advaita Vedanta was strongly influenced by Samkhya and that Sankhyan metaphysics. That doesn't mean that it accepts it wholesale, but it is influenced by quite a bit of it. And especially the idea of reflected consciousness. That's one of the ideas it picks up from Samkhya. Yeah, do you have a mic? Let's just wait for the mic. Yeah, that's okay. But hold on. Just wait for the mic. You may not think so, but that's for us to judge.
So when you say classical, you mean to say Gaudapada to Shankara or
No.
post-Shankara?
Also including post-Shankara.
Yeah, because this is Vivarana school's thought, right?
It's post-Shankara Advaita.
Post-Shankara.
Classical, what I mean is, as opposed to modern, and here modern, I'm thinking of sort of British colonial India and the figures like Radhakrishnan, TMP Mahadevan, Swami Vivekananda arguably. Classical Advaita encompasses many of the post-Shankara Advaitans as well, Madhusudana Saraswati, Chitsukha, and so on. Yeah, okay, right, and all these schools, and Vivarana, Bhamati. And now, so, there is a post-Shankara sub-school of Advaita Vedanta which supports the doctrine of pratibimba. Pratibimba literally means reflection, okay? And the concept of reflected consciousness is crucial to understanding this doctrine. So, any of you who knows anything about classical Advaita, this will all be pretty straightforward, but I'm going to review it anyway, because it helps us to set into relief what I identify as the main problem with Samkhya Yoga metaphysics. Okay, what is the soul reality according to classical Advaita Vedanta? Non-dual Brahman, non-dual pure consciousness. The only conscious being is Brahman. You might ask, well, what about us? We're going to get to that in a second. Okay, now, there are two other concepts that are introduced here within this Pratibimbavada of classical Advaita Vedanta. The second concept is what's called the reflector or the reflecting medium. Okay? So there's nothing but this non-dual pure consciousness. due to the reflecting medium of our insentient mind. Notice, the mind, the insentient mind is taken by Advaita Vedanta to be the reflector, or otherwise known as reflecting medium. It's insentient. It's an insentient medium to reflect consciousness. But what is reflected consciousness, according to classical Advaita Vedanta? Reflected consciousness is not the mind. It cannot be, because it has no consciousness. The mind is insentient by definition. So the reflected consciousness is the jiva, the individual soul, which is the locus of first-person experience. It's by means of the reflecting medium of the insentient mind that the conscious individual soul seems to exist, according to classical Advaita. So the insentient medium of mind is what makes it seem as if the mind is conscious. It's the jivatma which is making the mistake. The conscious individual soul is making the mistake, okay? According to classical Advaita. And then, but what's the truth according to classical Advaita? Jivas aren't real. There's no such thing as a jiva at the end. That's also part of the illusion, Maya. And so when you realize non-dual pure consciousness, what happens? You realize there were no jivas. There's neither reflecting medium, nor was there any reflected consciousness. There was just non-dual Brahman all along. Okay, now that's a whole other thing, and we don't need to talk about that. That's not the purpose of the class. But I wanted to introduce this crucial distinction in classical Advaita Vedanta between the reflector and reflected consciousness. Okay? And I think it's quite logical. I'm not saying that the philosophy is perfect. No, I'm saying that distinction between the reflector as the insentient mind and reflected consciousness as the jiva, the individual conscious soul, that's crucial. And I think that seems quite logical to me. Now, I think what tends to happen is sometimes when people are reading Samkhya and Yoga Sutras, for instance, they tend to read Advaitic ideas into the text. Okay. Now, we should be careful not to do that, okay? And at the same time, as I've been arguing, it seems to me that in order to give a coherent answer to the question of who is bound and who seeks liberation, Samkhya Yoga has to take a tip from the Vedantic Handbook. They need to posit the existence of a jiva. That's what I've been saying all along in my previous classes here. Now, why is that the case? So now let's move to the Samkhya and Yoga paradigm. What are the conscious entities here? Now, there isn't just one. That's one of the main differences between classical Advaita Vedanta and Samkhya and Yoga philosophy. There are multiple purushas. A purusha is an eternal conscious soul or self, okay? And it's eternally liberated. It's ever free. That's very important. The Sanskrit word is nitya mukta. Nobody denies that within traditional Samkhya and Yoga. The purusha can never be bound. Okay, so that can't be the candidate who is bound and who is seeking liberation. Okay, now let's move on. The reflector, they agree with Advaita Vedantins that the reflector is the insentient mind. Lakshman says asmita or buddhi, right? Bryant typically says buddhi, but same idea, insentient mind. They both fall under insentient mind. But now we get to the interesting question, reflected consciousness. Classical Advaita says reflected consciousness is the jiva. Now, Samkhya and Yoga don't have a concept of jiva at all. They can't have it, because where do you fit the jiva? On the purusha side? Can't, because the purusha is ever free. On the prakriti side? Can't, because it's strictly insentient, and the jiva is conscious. It's an individual conscious entity. So now what does it do? So the reflected consciousness, I say mind, question mark, question mark, question mark. Because sometimes they make it seem as if, I think Lakshman is not wildly wrong here. I think that if you read the traditional commentaries, and even if you look at Bryant, sometimes you come away feeling that they are saying that reflected consciousness is the insentient mind, but it can't be both. The insentient mind cannot play two roles here, metaphysically speaking. It cannot be the reflector and reflected consciousness. That makes a muddle of the whole thing. Logically speaking, the insentient mind can only really be the reflector, the reflecting medium of consciousness. Reflected consciousness? Big question mark. They don't have a good answer to the question, is my argument. So, Lakshman, you can now 2.0, you can respond in the YouTube comments again, or other people want to defend Lakshman's view. This is presumably not your husband, Lakshman, it's another Lakshman. Okay. All right. Any questions? Anyone here who wants to defend Lakshman or refute Lakshman or have a third position that you want to stake out? Yeah, okay. Vladimir.
I'm not arguing for or against, but I'm curious what a good analogy would be to put it out of the philosophical words, and like what imagery could help feel it.
Okay. Hard question. I mean, just come back to your own experience. That's why I asked about each of you. Why are you here, right? Why have you taken a spiritual life? Why have many of you received initiation? Because you're somehow dissatisfied. It's a feeling of dissatisfaction, right? You just feel that there's something much bigger and much vaster that we're missing, right? And that's why we take the spiritual life. That first-person experience, how do you explain it? How do Samkhya yogis explain that feeling of suffering, that feeling of insufficiency, that feeling of lack, that feeling of longing for something transcendental or higher? Where is that feeling located? What is the locus of first-person experience? That's the question. And I don't think Samkhya Yoga can give a coherent answer to that question. That's the way I'd put it. Yeah. Can you give the mic to Koshi?
So when we talk about classical Advaita Vedanta's view of Jiva, and when you say that it's the locus of the first person experience, that's where I'm finding it a little difficult to process it, because when I see the line, I feel that the first person experience is still happening in the consciousness, and Jiva is just a layer, like still.
It's an upadhi. The term
it's
used
an
in classical
upadhi.
Advaita is upadhi, limiting adjunct.
Exactly. Yeah, it's still the limiting adjunct, but the locus is still consciousness.
Oh, in that sense. Yeah. I mean, that's fine. Yeah, so the ultimate locus in that sense. But the point is, Advaita Vedanta at the Vyavaharika level, it means empirical or transactional reality, it admits a plurality of individual souls.
Right.
See, why is it that you have a different kind of first-person experience than I have, or that he has, or that he has? Advaita Vedanta still has to account for that. How does it do it? By positing these a plurality of individual souls, jivatmas. They're not real from the ultimate standpoint, but that we shouldn't mix up the two standpoints, that's all. What I think you're talking about is the ultimate locus of everything is non-dual Brahman. That's you're jumping to the Paramattika standpoint. But I'm encouraging us to, because the whole Vada, Pratibimba Vada, is grounded in the transactional standpoint. It's at the level of empirical reality. The only ultimate truth is non-dual pure consciousness. Now, the moment we get to reflector and reflected consciousness, we're already at the empirical level of reality. Does that make sense? So we're talking about upadhis. This is one upadhi, the insentient mind. The jiva is another upadhi. God is a third upadhi. All names and forms, other upadhi. Everything is an upadhi other than non-dual pure consciousness, according to classical Advaita. Okay?
Yep. And in terms of Samkhya and Yoga, when you say there's no locus of first-person experience, like even the purusha is not...
Yeah, and Lakshman, I think this is one of the best points that he made. He says, purusha can't be. Purusha is not self-conscious in that sense. It doesn't have first-personal experience in that sense. Because actually, from a Samkhya Yoga standpoint, any first-person experience is suffering. Remember that sutra we read earlier in the same book? Everything is suffering. Dukkham eva sarvam vivekinaha. Literally everything is suffering. First-person experience as such is suffering. That's what the Sanskrit term for that first-person experience is bhoga. And liberation means you don't have to do bhoga anymore. It doesn't mean enjoyment. It means it's a much broader than that. And we're going to find when we talk about the ensuing sutras that when you attain liberation, the purusha doesn't perceive the world at all anymore. It's not even a witness. That's important to keep in mind. Yeah, it might be surprising, but it's here. We'll get to it. Yeah. Any other questions?
May I get a clarification?
Yeah.
What then is the purpose of multiple purushas? Like, are they all attributable as an identical?
Oh, wonderful segue into today's sutras. So thank you. Okay, so let's plunge in. I'm serious. It's exactly, it answers that question. So, 2.21. Please repeat after me. Tadattha eva drishyasya atma. Okay. So it's the next sutra, 2.22, that addresses your question, but this is an important preceding sutra. Okay. Bryant's translation. The essential nature of that which is seen, the drishya, prakriti, all of prakriti, including the body-mind, is exclusively for the sake of the seer. It's a very interesting sutra. The essential nature of prakriti is that its whole purpose is to serve the purusha. How? How does Prakriti serve purusha? Bryant has a one-paragraph commentary on this, which I'll read. It's helpful. He says, the seen, that is the knowable, buddhi, and ultimately Prakriti herself, exists only for the sake of purusha, who is the seer, reiterates Vyasa, and is thus dependent on another, not on itself. Prakriti exists for the sake of purusha. What does that mean? As 2.18 informed us, the purpose or function of the seen, Prakriti, is to provide either experience, bhoga, or liberation, moksha, to purusha. Notice what's happening here? Do you notice the shift? People who are following the class will know that in previous classes, he's been pretty adamant that the person who's experiencing suffering and who gets liberation is the buddhi. And now suddenly it becomes purusha. You see that vacillation? I see it all the time, going back and forth between buddhi and purusha. They seesaw. Okay, so is to provide either experience or liberation to purusha. And why can't that be right? Because the purusha is ever free. It's eternally liberated. It doesn't need liberation, and it's never bound. It's never subject to bondage. Now, and this purpose is fulfilled when experience or liberation has been attained. Doesn't make much sense to me because the purusha is eternally liberated, as I just said. The nature of experience consists of pleasure and pain pleasure and pain are not conscious of themselves. They are experienced by an other. This other is purusha. How can purusha experience pleasure and pain? Not making much sense to me. Maybe one of you can explain this, but I can't make heads or tails of it. Therefore, the purpose of the seen is not for itself, but for the seer. The seer here is the purusha, remember, like the witness. Just as the purpose of a bed, continues Vijnana Bhikshu, is for the sleeper, not for itself. The bed is made for the sleeper, for somebody to use it to sleep on. Or as Vachaspati Mishra puts it, the relationship of Purusha and Prakriti is like that of the king and his possessions. So, am I the only one who feels puzzled by this? That Purusha, okay, there are two issues here. One is the big can of worms that we've been talking about for a long time, which is that if nature, Prakriti, everything in nature exists for the sake of either giving experience to the Purusha or liberating the Purusha, this doesn't seem like a very coherent philosophical claim or thesis. Why? Because the Purusha doesn't need liberation and it can never be subject to bondage. Okay. Now, a separate issue is, remember, there's no creator God in Samkhya and Yoga philosophy. God didn't create this world of names and forms. God didn't create Prakriti. Okay. As I mentioned in previous classes, Swami Vivekananda, he has several lectures called Samkhya and Vedanta and things like that, where he kind of brings Samkhya into conversation with Vedanta. And he argues that Samkhya needs some Vedantic correctives. One of those correctives is the multiple Purushas has to become one Atman. Okay. And we're going to get to that in a second. We're getting back to Kailash's question. And then the second major corrective, Vedantic corrective to Samkhya Yoga, is that behind Prakriti, this primordial matrix of nature, you have to posit Ishvara, the creator God, who is both the material and the efficient cause of Prakriti. Okay? Because Swamiji says you can't really make sense of the Samkhya and Yoga system unless you posit an Ishvara, a creator God, behind Prakriti. Okay? I think building on that insight of Swamiji's, now coming back to this sutra, what sense does it make to say that something insentient has a purpose? Any kind of purpose. Isn't that a kind of anthropomorphization? Did I miss a syllable? Yeah, right? We're anthropomorphizing nature by claiming that it has aims, that it has a telos, that it has a goal, that it has a purpose. It can't. Nothing insentient can have a purpose. The creator of something insentient can have a purpose. That's the point of Vijnana Bhikshu gives the analogy of a bed. The bed is insentient. The bed is made by a conscious being for the sake of another conscious being, or maybe the same conscious being. I can make my own bed, right? But the bed can't have a purpose in itself, right? Are you following?
You mean like an innate purpose?
Yeah. Yeah.
The purpose is for Purusha.
Yeah.
Apparently can make the...
No, innate purpose. Does the bed have innate
The
purpose?
example that he's giving is that what is the purpose of the bed? The bed doesn't have any innate purpose.
Right. But you also wouldn't say that the bed has a purpose, right? You're going to say that the purpose of the bed, so maybe there's an ambiguity in the language, the purpose of the bed, but a conscious being is saying that. Do you see what I mean? A conscious being says the purpose of the bed is to be slept on, right? By another conscious being. Exactly. From the Purusha's perspective, we can say that Prakriti has a purpose, right? But Prakriti by itself can't have a purpose. Like that's what you're saying is innate purpose. That's a nice way of thinking about it. Exactly. Right? It's the Purusha that posits a purpose for Purusha. I mean, for Prakriti. Yeah, exactly. Right? So it's like Darwin. Often when you read Origin of Species, sometimes he does use this kind of teleological language to explain nature. But at the same time, he's not positing a God in his scientific system, in his theory of evolution, right? How is that possible? He says that language is metaphorical. And then he brings in the mechanism of natural selection, which is strictly, naturalistic. You don't have to posit some kind of transcendental entity. And so he says, in a certain sense, evolution has a kind of, it's goal-driven in a certain way. Species are getting better or kind of better at survival, right? That's the whole point of survival of the fittest, right? Might seem like a purpose. But he's very aware of that, and he's very aware of the fact that the language he's using is kind of teleological. But he's he's using it, but then saying, but don't think that I'm positing a creator God behind anything. No. And it doesn't have a purpose in itself. It doesn't have an innate purpose. But through the mechanism of natural selection, and then later we find out genetic mutation, we end up with evolution, right? But this is a philosophy that posits purushas, which are completely disconnected from nature, and which are ever free. And so as I said, there are two problems I think are raised by this sutra. Number one, it doesn't make much sense to me to say that nature is for the sake of the experience or liberation of purusha, because purusha can't be subject to bondage or any kind of experience. And secondly, is already liberated, so it doesn't stand in need of liberation. And number two, I don't think it makes much sense to say that nature, which is insentient, has an innate purpose, any kind of purpose whatsoever. Okay, so now, think about that for yourselves, and if you have an idea of how to defend Samkhya and Yoga on this point, please let me know. And I wanted to flag also that one scholar has talked about this issue in detail in some small books, and he makes a similar argument, actually, that nature in itself can't really have a purpose in Samkhya and Yoga philosophy. He's a Swiss scholar. His name is Johannes Bronkhorst. That's a nice Germanic name. Bronkhorst. Bronkhorst. Okay. All right. Now, here's the next little paragraph in the Bryant commentary is a nice segue into the next sutra. And it's an extremely interesting sutra. We may actually spend the rest of the class just discussing this sutra. It's fascinating. And we get into classical Advaita versus Samkhya again. Okay, here he goes. Since Prakriti has nothing more to do once its purposes are fulfilled, asks Ramananda Saraswati rhetorically, with an eye to the next sutra, does this mean that deprived of its function, Prakriti would no longer be perceived? Might it even cease to exist? It's very interesting. It's like that famous, if a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody to hear it, it doesn't make any noise, right? Okay, and so this next sutra, 2.22, tackles this very important question. It's realism versus idealism, right? That's the big debate. So please repeat after me. Kritartham prati nashtam api anashtam tad anya sadharanatvat it's a tongue twister, yeah. Okay, so here we go. It's a little bit complicated. Although the scene, what is scene? Prakriti. Although the scene, Prakriti, ceases to exist for one whose purpose is accomplished, meaning the liberated Purusha, the Kritartha, the one who has accomplished what needed to be achieved. So literally ceases to exist for that person. It has not ceased, Prakriti has not ceased to exist altogether, since it is common to other Āraṇya Purushas, meaning non-liberated souls, non-liberated Purushas. It's very interesting. Prakriti, let's say one of you, Kailash, gets liberation. Lucky him. What happens to this world? We're still stuck in it. For him, his Purusha, no longer sees this world and no longer feels suffering. Of course, how can his purusha feel suffering? That's another, as I said, that complicated question. But the point is, let's grant that. But the other people like Indranil Jiva, well, Jiva, we can't use the word Jiva, so that's the problem. But anyway, yeah, exactly. The Indranil Purusha still perceives this world. The Lila Purusha still perceives the world. So it's still here because it's perceived by others. But then you might ask, well, eventually, though, everybody will get liberated. But no, apparently. So we're going to get to that in a second. So let me read Bryant's commentary here. And then you'll see how this sutra becomes a linchpin in one of the main Samkhya Yoga critiques of classical Advaita Vedanta. It's quite interesting. Okay, so it's all in this commentary. It's a lengthy commentary. Bryant says, this sutra situates the yoga tradition as realist, the view that the world is objectively and externally real, irrespective of whether we perceive it, as opposed to idealist, meaning the world is not objectively or externally real, but a product of the mind. So a famous Western philosopher who defended an idealist view was George Berkeley. Esse est percipi, which means to be is to be perceived. So the moment you don't perceive something, or that thing is not perceived, it doesn't exist anymore. That's an example of idealism. Okay, now, Patanjali and the commentarial tradition will take some pains to refute the idealist viewpoint in chapter 4. That's a later chapter, which we're going to get to eventually. The seen may have accomplished its purpose, kritartha, for the fortunate, successful yogi who has attained liberation, and thus may cease to exist, nashtam. That's the word nashtam in this sutra, 2.22. For such a soul, but only in the sense that the liberated soul ceases to be aware of it. That's what we were talking about earlier. Once I achieve liberation, I don't perceive this world anymore. Because the very perception of the world itself is a source of suffering. Perception itself is suffering. Which means if you're fully liberated from suffering, you shouldn't be perceiving. Not even as a detached witness. Even being a detached witness is not good enough. Because imagine like you're in a nightmare, or like Clockwork Orange, kind of your eyes are being forced open, you have to see these terrible things. It can still be, scary. Okay. Now, then it says, it has not accomplished, so Prakriti has not accomplished its purpose for all other purushas, says Vyasa, which means the non-liberated souls. It needs to provide objects of experience for everyone else. Therefore, it still has a purpose and does not cease to exist. Anashtam. So that's the opposite of nashtam, it's anashtam. Actually, it continues to exist. For whom? For the non-liberated souls. And then, Vachaspati Mishra. Color may not be seen by a blind man, says Vachaspati Mishra, but it does not cease to be, since it is seen by those who are not blind. In this sense, the conjunction, the sanyoga, between the seers, in the sense of the totality of purushas, and the seen, prakriti, is said to be eternal. So this is important. It's an important doctrine of Samkhya Yoga philosophy, that the conjunction, the sanyoga between purusha and prakriti is eternal. And you might ask, how is that possible? Then how can anybody get liberation if the conjunction is eternal? The conjunction is the cause of all our suffering. So liberation means liberation from what we thought was a conjunction between purusha and prakriti, but it turns out that they were never actually conjoined. But now if the conjunction itself is eternal, how can anybody get liberation? That's the question. Kailash?
But we do have multiple purushas, right? So there's always going to be a purusha that is
exactly.
in sanyoga with
Look
prakriti.
at that. You keep anticipating Bryant. So this is exactly what he goes on to say. He says, in this sense, the conjunction between the seers, in the sense of the totality of purushas, and the seen is said to be eternal because the purushas are innumerable. So one need not posit the hypothetical possibility that eventually all purushas will become liberated, causing prakriti to become redundant due to an absence of purushas needing experience. Because the number of purushas is infinite, countless, innumerable. Therefore, even if one lucky purusha gets liberated, there's still an infinite number of other purushas which are still perceiving nature, which means there will never be a point in time in the future, even in the future, when prakriti ceases to exist altogether. Why? Because there's always going to be some bound souls. I just said souls, but again, what the heck is that bound soul? I still don't know in Samkhya Yoga philosophy. Okay, now we get to this really interesting debate between, on the basis of this sutra primarily, the debate between Sankhya yogis and classical Advaitins. Bryant says, this sutra is important to the yoga school, Vijnana Bhikshu points out, since otherwise, I'm skipping that. Okay, then next. The commentators are motivated by this sutra to argue the position of the Yoga and Sankhya schools, which posit an eternal plurality of purushas. Okay, Bahu Purushavada, there are many purushas, whether in the liberated or non-liberated state. In distinction to the Advaita or non-dualist school of Vedanta, which holds that the plurality and individuality of the purushas exist only in the non-liberated state of ignorance. You following? According to classical Advaita, we already talked about that in relation to Kaushiki's question earlier, which is that from the standpoint of classical Advaita Vedanta, the jivas themselves are only real from the transactional standpoint, from the Vyavaharika standpoint. In reality, there's only one conscious being, and it's non-dual Brahman, pure consciousness. And even those apparently conscious individual souls turn out to be unreal. The consciousness of those individual souls is not unreal. But when you remove the jivatva upadhi, the jiva upadhi from non-dual pure consciousness, what's left is what's real, which is non-dual pure conscious, but without any kind of delimitations. Following? Okay. So now, Bryant says, this particular school of Vedanta, meaning classical Advaita Vedanta, posits that upon attaining enlightenment, the Purusha, more typically referred to as Atman by followers of Vedanta, realizes that all plurality and individuality is the product of illusion and merges into the all-encompassing, non-dual, absolute truth, Brahman. Okay? So now we're going to get in this really interesting debate between the Sankhya yogis and the classical Advaitins. And you might be wondering, well, how does Sutra 2.22 play a role here? We're about to see. Okay, but before we get there, Bryant makes a scriptural point here. Okay, because all of them, Sankhya, Yoga, and Vedanta are all considered Astika schools of Indian philosophy. What does Astika mean? Anyone know? In what? No, that's the standard understanding in modern Indian languages. When you say Astika, it means somebody who believes in God. Nastika means an atheist, right? But that's not what it means in the context of traditional Indian philosophy. The Astika scholars are those who accept the authority of the Vedas, interestingly. And Nastika refers to those who reject the authority of the Vedas. Who are those? Charvaka, Buddhists, Jainas. And the Astika schools are Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Sankhya, Yoga, and then Purvamimamsa, and then Vedanta. So Vedanta falls under the Astika. So what is their shared kind of basis? The Vedas. They both agree on the Vedas. So they also argue about the right way to interpret the Vedantic scriptures, the Upanishads, primarily the Upanishads, okay? So now, this paragraph from page 227 of Bryant's commentary is very interesting. To buttress their view meaning the Sankhya Yoga view, of an eternal plurality of purushas, scripturally, several commentators point to the verse in the Shvetashvatara Upanishad 4.5 that speaks metaphorically of a nanny goat, Prakriti, Aja. It's a famous verse, Prakriti, whose nature is that of the gunas, the three gunas, sattva, rajas, tamas, and who produces evolutes of the same nature, being enjoyed by one passionate billy goat, Purusha. It's a funny metaphor. It's not very feminist, frankly. Okay. But abandoned by another billy goat who has finished enjoying her. This resonates with Patanjali Sutra here. Just because one billy goat may leave the nanny goat, she nonetheless remains to be enjoyed by another billy goat. One Purusha may become liberated, but all the other unliberated Purushas remain experiencing Prakriti. Therefore, whether in the liberated or non-liberated states, there must be a plurality of Purushas, and each one must be individual. This is the view of all 6 schools of classical Hindu thought, except the sub-branch of the Vedanta school, Advaita Vedanta. Are you following? The 6 schools, he means the orthodox schools, which I mentioned, the Astika schools. Vedanta itself is a huge tradition under which you have many sub-traditions, only one of which rejects this idea of a plurality of conscious beings, conscious souls. Only classical Advaita Vedanta is the outlier in this regard, even within the tradition of Vedanta. All the bhakti schools of Vedanta believe even in the liberated state, there are individual souls. Why? So that they can dwell in the eternal heaven with their beloved personal God. That's the idea, right? Okay. Now, I'm skipping a little bit, because now we get to another really interesting issue. Page 228. The enlightened yogi sees that all differences are the product of ahankara and buddhi, says Vijnana Bhikshu. So now we're back to explaining Samkhya and Yoga. And that therefore all purushas are one. In the sense, this is getting to Kailash's question now. Listen carefully. All purushas are one. How? Not in the non-dual sense. In the sense that they have the same essence. But this does not mean that there is factually only one purusha metaphysically. The myriad purushas are identical in the sense that their true nature transcends all distinctions, which are the product of Prakriti and her gunas. But this does not mean that they become identical in the sense of losing their individuality upon attaining liberation, nor that they merge into one ultimate Atman Brahman. Does this answer your question? Or it doesn't satisfy you, but it... Yeah. Well, can you give the mic to Kailash?
It's in computer science, we have the notion of classes and instances. So what they're saying is that the purushas are class, and these instances just exist. Yeah. Okay.
But there are no distinction.
There are no distinction. Yeah. So then how do you tell the instances apart? Yeah.
So this is if some people who followed this class from the beginning will remember that, or may remember in the introduction. This is one of the problems that comes up, that some critics of Samkhya and Yoga point out that this is the big question. What distinguishes one purusha from another? What is it? Name the distinguishing mark. Right. And here it seems difficult. They can say something like, see, in philosophy, that you say instance. In computer science, in philosophy, you say token. So the token entities, right? So you can say that even though they're identical in essence, nonetheless they're different tokens, and there are many different token purushas. But exactly what is the distinguishing mark? There may not be a clear answer, or maybe I'm just not aware of it. So again, Lakshman or someone else want to come to the rescue of Samkhya and Yoga? Go ahead and try. So what exactly is the distinguishing feature from one purusha to another? Okay, now we get to this super interesting question. I find it super interesting. I'm sure many of you will too. Because at one time I was deeply invested in and interested in classical Advaita Vedanta. Okay, here's the paragraph. If there were only one Atman, continues Vijnana Bhikshu, how could some Atmans be liberated and others still in samsara? This is very interesting. Now he's building a pretty sophisticated critique of classical Advaita Vedanta on the basis of 2.22. He says, it's because we accept metaphysically that there are multiple purushas that we have no problem explaining how, when one soul is liberated, other people are still stuck here. But how do you Advaitins explain this phenomenon? Not everybody gets liberated at once. Obviously, we're still stuck here. We haven't gotten liberation. But there are other great souls like Shankara and others who did get liberation. But if liberation consists in total eradication of ignorance, and this world itself is a product of ignorance, as Shankara repeats many times, then there should be no world. The moment that even a single soul gets liberated, and yet there have been so many liberated souls, and yet we still perceive the world. How is that possible? So now, let me keep reading so you'll get a sense of this. If there were only one Atman, how could some Atmans be liberated and others still in samsara? A number of the commentators draw attention to this argument, which also surfaces in the Vedanta schools opposing the Advaita viewpoint. So there are other schools of Vedanta, like Ramanuja's Vishittadvaita and others, they make a similar kind of argument against classical Advaita. So a lot of people are ganging up against classical Advaita on this. They see it's a kind of weak point in the philosophy of classical Advaita Vedanta. Here it is. If there were ultimately only one Atman, as the Advaita school posits, then when any one Purusha attains liberation, so would all other Purushas. Since according to the Advaita school, they are all in reality one Purusha, Atman. The Jiva doesn't even exist from the ultimate standpoint, right? In other words, if one Purusha became liberated by realizing that all distinctions among Purushas were illusory, and that all Purushas were in actuality one undivided Atman, then with the ignorance of duality removed, there would no longer be any more divided Atmans or independent Purushas. There can't be, because from the ultimate standpoint, there are no jivas. If one responds that the realization of the oneness of Atman applies only to the liberated Purusha, that might be a logical response. Yeah, it applies to the realized soul, but not to the others. If one responds that the realization of the oneness of Atman applies only to the liberated Purusha, but not to the other non-liberated Purushas, then one has implicitly accepted a duality. In the supposed oneness of Atman, a duality between liberated and non-liberated purushas. You can't have that duality from the ultimate standpoint. You following? In reality, there are no individual souls at all, according to Advaita. Okay, such a conclusion would be awkward for the defenders of this position, say the commentators, contradicting the non-dualistic position of the Advaita school, but approaching the position of the Yoga school. So now, here's the challenge to some of you who might love classical Advaita Vedanta. Try to defend classical Advaita against this charge.
Levels of reality.
Right.
And the answer was levels of reality, right? That's what sets it apart. Is that at
so use this idea of levels of reality to answer the question.
Well, at the paramarthic level, there is only non-dual Brahman, and the transactional reality is illusory. But to the jiva,
For whom?
For the jiva.
But the jiva doesn't exist. He's staring up at the sky for you online people who are wondering what's going on now. It's just dead
Someone
silence.
rescue me, I guess.
Okay, so now Vladimir.
Okay, I'll try to answer with an analogy. So if soul reality, non-dual, pure existence, if we imagine it as a sheet hanging on a clothesline, and you have the sun being pure consciousness shining onto, let's say, just a field of mirrors.
Wait, where's the sheet now?
The sheet's like on a clothesline.
Where's the mirrors? Where are the mirrors?
On the ground.
Oh, okay.
And the sun is in the
This getting
sky.
very elaborate. Okay.
You've never done the laundry before.
Okay, then, I don't know what's going on.
So sun hits mirror, mirror hits the sheet, leaves a sunspot on the sheet that's hanging to dry.
Okay.
So
That is the Pratibhimbavada, basically. I mean, it's something along the lines of the
right, yeah. I'm
reflection.
going off of what
Yeah,
I'm
right,
cheating
right.
off of your board
Yeah,
there.
yeah. But remember, this is all from the standpoint of transactional reality, the reflection stuff. And the ultimate standpoint is non-dual pure consciousness.
So then liberation would be the sun getting so hot that it just burns a hole through that sheet for that individual spot.
Right, but here's the problem. Right, I get what you're saying.
Okay.
But it means that the rest of the sheet is still intact, right?
Yeah, but
Which means the world still exists for those other souls.
as existence, yes. But there's existence, consciousness, bliss.
See, here's the thing. Here's another way to put it. This is just another way of putting the same thing. Classical Advaita is based on a metaphysics of what's called ajata. Ajata, which literally means non-origination. This never happened. This class never actually happened. Nothing is happening. The dream was never dreamt. There never was a dream. That's how radical the Advaitic position is. There never were jivas, actually. And there still aren't jivas, there never will be jivas. So it gets really heady and weird. Now, I think that there's only one remotely logical answer from a classical Advaitic standpoint. And here it is. I'm going to write down two terms on the board here. Now we're getting into some of the differences in doctrine in post-Shankara classical Advaita. One is called Drishti, Srishti, Vada. The other is the opposite. You reverse the words. Srishti, Drishti, Vada. Okay, now, Drishti means? Seeing. Srishti means? Creation. This means seeing. This means creation. Vada means doctrine. So now, the mainstream doctrine, this is what Shankara seems to believe. Gaudapada actually sorry, other way around. I'm mixing them up. The mainstream doctrine is this one, Srishti Drishti. Okay? Okay. Shankara and many other classical Advaitins, and the way that it's taught to householders and others, because otherwise you'll get frightened, is this Srishti Drishti Vada, which means this world exists independently of anyone's perception of it. Even if nobody is perceiving that tree, it's still there. The opposite view is what's called idealism. This is the view that the creation only exists so long as I perceive it. And the moment I cease to perceive it, it doesn't exist. What's an example? A dream. And seeing a snake, yeah. Instead of the rope, right, actually. Not really in the rope, but yeah. Right? So now, the mainstream view, Srishdishtivada. This is what the Samkhya yogi philosophers are attacking. They're saying this doesn't really make any sense if you think about it logically and deeply and consistently. If you follow the metaphysics of Advaita Vedanta to the end, what you find is that you can't really make sense of multiple purushas or atmans, some of which are jivas, some of which are liberated, others which are not. You can't explain. It doesn't make sense within this framework of the two tiers of reality, Vyavaharika and Paramatika. Okay. And what some classical Advaitins do, post-Shankara, and then also pre-Shankara, because Gaudapada, I think, is one of the first to defend this view, is to go for what's called radical solipsism. Radical solipsism. It's like Berkeley, actually. Like Berkeley, it's not the same. Let's not get mixed up paradigms here. Okay. Because now, and actually one example is, maybe surprising to some people, Madhusudana Saraswati, one of the most famous classical Advaitins. I feel like people online can't hear me, so I can't. Okay, so Madhusudana Saraswati wrote a book called Siddhanta Bindu, where he basically says that the only logical position for Advaitins is Drishti Srishtivada and not Srishti Srishtivada. He actually acknowledges the force of the critique. Okay, and so he says, therefore, we have to posit that there aren't really a plurality of jivas at all. There's only one. That's called Eka Jiva Vada. Okay, so this Drishti Srishti Vada, now sorry about the mess on the board, but this Drishti Srishti Vada entails Eka Jiva Vada. Whereas Srishti Drishti Vada entails Bahu Jiva Vada, multiple jivas, okay? So it gets kind of creepy and like kind of Matrix / what's that movie? Inception, this other stuff. We might think that you have one jiva, he has another, that he's another jiva. No, all of you are figments of my imagination. The big question then is, this is the big like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Who's the one jiva? I am. No, you are. And it gets like, everyone wants to be the one jiva, right? It gets kind of weird and heady. Okay, so if I'm the one jiva, that means you're all part of figments of my imagination, but you think you're the jiva because you're perceiving me, and then I become a figment of your imagination. This whole class, thankfully, is not even real. You see? So this is, to my mind, the best answer classical Advaita Vedanta can give to the problem raised by Samkhya Yogins, by other schools of Vedanta. Now, is it fully satisfying? No, not really. Why? Part of the reason is because even that one jiva can't exist. But at least he can actually embed it within this two-tier framework. He'll say, from the transactional standpoint, there's only one jiva, dreaming the rest of the world and dreaming the other jivas. So the other jivas aren't actually real. They're just part of that one jiva's dream. They're all fictions of that one jiva's imagination, right? So it's a logical answer, I think, but it's not the ultimate answer. It's not ultimately true that there's even one jiva. There are no jivas. Even that one jiva is an upadi. The one jiva, when he gets liberated, wakes up from the dream and then realizes there never was a dream, there never was a dreamer, right? There was never a world. That's the idea. So this is something that Bryant doesn't actually talk about, this idea of appealing to Eka Jiva Vada and Drishti Srishti Vada, but I think that's important to mention. Classical Advaita Vedanta does have an answer, and it's called Eka Jiva Vada. Now, do you want to go there? By the way, in the context of our tradition, the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition, let's see how deeply you know our literature. Does anyone know which monk in our order upholds Drishti Srishti Vada combined with Eka Jiva Vada? This is a tough question. Anyone? Now, there might be multiple, but this is one who's actually published on it and openly stated. I'll even give you the name of the essay, and I bet you still won't be able to guess. And Preeti here is freaking, because she usually gets answers to all these questions. Okay, ready? The essay is called It's one or the other. Either my philosophy and my religion, or my religion and my philosophy. I think it's my philosophy and my religion. Who is this mystery monk from the Ramakrishna order who explicitly comes out and says, I am an Eka Jivavadi and Drishishtivadi?
It would be so fitting if it was Brahmananda.
Okay, but it's not, no. He was a bhakta at the end of the day.
No, I'm just saying from the name.
Oh, I see, yeah. Well, all the names are kind of like that. But so what's, any other guesses? Huh? Wow, people are just throwing stuff out there. No, not Satvakashananda. But you're in the right country. Huh, what? Does his name start with B? No. Right country. Notice what I said, right country. And now, some are like not Advaitans, so you obviously not Prabhupada. He's too much of a bhakta. Huh? No. Too many hints, man. Come on. Okay, begins with an A. Yeah, the name begins with an A. Wow, you guys. Oh. One of the greatest Advaitas in our order, for goodness sakes. Yes, thank the Lord. Ashokananda, the head of our San Francisco Center, the previous head, of course, former, like a while ago. Look up this essay. It's very interesting, called My Philosophy and My Religion. Because most monks are not going to come out and say that. There's one other monk who's kind of very renegade from a philosophical standpoint, who wrote a whole book called God Realization Through Reason. His name is Swami Ishwarananda. Very interesting. And it moves in this kind of a direction as well. But Ashokanandaji comes out and says it. So it's quite interesting. And in terms of modern day sadhus, I was told by Swami Atmarupanandaji, he himself told me when we were in Biluma together, that he believes this doctrine as well. So you're all figments in Atmarupanandaji's imagination. Yeah. It's Drishishishti. And then I don't even accept classical Advaita, I accept Sri Ramakrishna's Vivekananda Vedanta. I say classical Advaita is just a part of Sri Ramakrishna's broader spiritual philosophy, which also accepts the reality of Shakti and all the yogas as direct paths. That's my approach. Now, the unofficial orthodoxy for most of the monks would be something like Drishti Shrishti Advaita Vedanta, and then you get a few stray classical Advaitans in the order who support the radical solipsism view, Eka Jivavada and Drishishtivada. That's how I see it. Okay, any questions? Anything online? No? Okay, we're good. Anyone here who has a burning question or want to argue with me? You're now converted to Eka Jivavada? It's trippy, right? Huh?
Gaudapada is the man.
Gaudapada's, I loved Gaudapada back in the day. He's hardcore. Yeah. You know what I like about him is that he goes all the way with it. He's a hardcore Advaitan. He doesn't compromise. These days I find most Advaitans are these namby-pamby Advaitans. That's a good Indian word, namby-pamby. It means neither here nor there. It's like, I'm an Advaitan, but I still sort of believe in the world. I still sort of have bhakti and believe in a personal God. Come on. Be like Totapuri. If you want to be an Advaitan, be Totapuri. And make fun of Sri Ramakrishna for clapping his hands to Mother Kali. And say, what are you, making chapatis? Be real.
Just
not this compromise stuff. Yeah.
Just navel gazing a little bit. Gaudapada was the guru of Shankaracharya, right? So
traditionally,
So he obviously came up with his theory before Shankaracharya did.
That's certainly true.
And so
Mandukya Karika.
Yeah,
is the main
exactly right. So isn't it's conceivable that Shankaracharya is giving a discount, essentially, a concession to, like you said, householders. Otherwise, we won't even attempt because it's so daunting.
So hold on, Kailash. Interesting suggestion, but hold on. There are a couple things here. Historically speaking, does Gaudapada emerge in a vacuum? No. Where does he get his solipsism from? Do you know? Mahayana Buddhism. He was strongly influenced by a particular school of Buddhism called Yogacara Buddhism. Okay. And they teach this view that everything is a dream. It's my dream. This whole world is my dream. Gaudapada was strongly influenced by Buddhism. That's why one of the worst insults you can hurl at classical Advaitans is, Madhva uses it, other people, they say, Prachanna Bauddha. You're a crypto-Buddhist. You're a Buddhist in disguise. It's devastating. To somebody who's supposed to follow the Vedas, right? That's like the worst insult, slap in the face. So, okay, that's the historical thing. Now, that's Gaudapada. Now you're asking, well, how do we understand Shankara in relation to Gaudapada? This gets complicated because if you go to a traditional classical Advaita Pandit, and you say, why does Shankara deviate from Gaudapada? He's going to pounce on you and say, how dare you use the word deviation? That word is not allowed. It's not in our dictionary. There's no such thing as deviation. Shankara and Gaudapada teach the same doctrine. So that's like the extreme kind of orthodox view. There is no difference in doctrine between Shankara and Gaudapada. Now, I think it's more plausible that there is a difference in view. I think it's pretty clear that Gaudapada's Mandukya Karika teaches a more solipsistic doctrine. From the ultimate standpoint, I think they agree. Metaphysically, the ultimate metaphysical truth is ajata and the sole truth of non-dual pure consciousness. On that, Shankara and Gaudapada agree. The question is, from this standpoint, what is the right way of thinking about this world of names and forms and us as conscious beings? And Gaudapada seems to say there's one, yatha swapne dvayabhasam spandate maya manaha tatha jagrat dvayabhasam spandate maya manaha. Just as in the dream state, the mind spins out a dream world, just so, exactly like that, the mind spins out a dream world even in the waking state. This is a direct quotation from the Mandukya Karika. That's solipsism. Shankara, interestingly, look it up. For those of you, a lot of people talk about Shankara, don't read Shankara, so please do try to read him. Okay, in his Brahma Sutra Bhashya, he's got a whole section refuting the Yogacara Buddhist position, which is that this world is a dream. And he gives a bunch of reasons why the waking state has a higher degree of reality than the dream state. He just he brings out a number of reasons. Now, his refutation of Yogacara ipso facto counts as a refutation of Gaudapada's own solipsism. Of course, the traditional pundits won't accept that, but it seems kind of obvious that that's the case because they apply also to Gaudapada's claims about solipsism. Right? So Shankara will give examples like this. He says, look, notice, you might be dreaming at night, but what happens when you wake up? The dream breaks. But notice in the case of the waking state that there's a greater continuity. We wake up to the same waking state as we did the night before, whereas we dream new dreams and then, right, the dream breaks and then another dream. And there's no continuity from the dream in night 1 to the dream in night 2 to the dream in night 3, whereas there's a long continuity. Now, does that mean that it's real? No, of course not. Shankara says ultimately even the waking state dream breaks, but only with the knowledge of Brahman. That's the idea. But still, in terms of degrees of reality, the waking state, according to Shankara, is more real, but not ultimately real. More real than the dream state. No, even at the level of the lower truth, the waking state has a greater degree of reality than the dream state, is Shankara's position. Whereas Gaudapada says, he just radically equates them ontologically. The waking state is no more real than the dream state. Now, coming to the gospel, interesting, the gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. What kind of Advaita does Sri Ramakrishna teach? When he teaches, he doesn't encourage it, but he says, Totapuri taught me like this. What did he teach him? Which one? What's the example he uses? When Mohima Chakraborty comes, he says, I'll teach you a story based on the philosophy you like. And he tells the example of a farmer. Why does nobody know this story? Come on. Huh? There's a farmer who loses a son. And then he dreams. He falls asleep. And then he dreams he's a king. And he's got 7 sons. Wonderful sons. And he's a king. He's extremely filthy rich and he's on top of the world. Then what happens? Wakes up from the dream. And now his wife sees him the next day, all refreshed and having his Folgers. And she's asking, why aren't you mourning for the death of your son? What kind of monster are you? And she says, should I be mourning for the death of my one son in the waking state or the 7 sons I lost in the dream state? Everything was so nice and hunky-dory in the dream state when I was a king. That means what? He sees no additional reality in the waking state than he does in the dream state. So anyway, Totapuri seems to have taught Sri Ramakrishna hardcore Advaita, Gaudapada kind of Advaita. If you want to be an Advaita, go all the way with it. Otherwise, stick with Bhakti. Okay. Any other final comments? I think we should wrap it up. I think we're good. Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you next Thursday, same time, same place. Jai Ma. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.